Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Operation Ajax, when the US overthrew Iran's democracy. In the next few minutes you'll see how a single oil concession set the stage for a global embargo, how a democratically elected leader collided with empires old and new, and how short-term stability rewired a nation's incentives for a generation. We'll trace the money, the memos, and the mechanisms of power. By the end, you can judge for yourself whether engineered stability ever stays stable. Let's set the stage. Picture Iran at the dawn of the 20th century. Oil isn't yet the lifeblood of global industry, but it's about to be. In 1901, the Darcy concession grants a British syndicate sweeping rights to explore and produce oil across most of Iran. Out of this grows the Anglo-Persian, later Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the ancestor of what we know today as BP. One signature, one exclusive concession, and suddenly the country's most valuable resource is governed by a contract written far from Tehran. Ask yourself, when the rules are set abroad, whose priorities shape the game at home? Over the next decades, wells are drilled, the Abadan refinery rises into one of the largest in the world, and tankers push out to fuel navies, factories, and the machinery of modern life. Revenue does flow to Iran, but control over prices, output, and accounting sits largely with the company. Think of it as an early version of a platform monopoly. The operator decides the terms, the user provides the inputs, and the transparency lives behind the operator's ledger. If you were an Iranian lawmaker in the 1930s or 40s, would you call that partnership or dependency? In 1933, under Reza Shah, the concession is renegotiated. On paper, it looks like a reset, new royalties, longer timelines, promises of investment. But here's the quiet continuity. Operational control, marketing networks, and the information advantage remain in foreign hands. That asymmetry matters. In any system, whoever sets the measurement rules tends to capture the upside and offload the downside. In oil, that means the company can smooth profits through pricing and transfer practices, while the host state rides a roller coaster of revenues it can't fully audit. Imagine trying to run a national budget when the speedometer is held by someone else. By mid-century, the incentives are locked in. For the company and its home government, Iran is a strategic barrel and a balance sheet line, worth defending from competitors and political shocks. For many Iranians, AIOC becomes the symbol of a promise never delivered, modern wealth leaving through the port of Abadan while neighborhoods near the refinery still feel the dust. This isn't simply about money. It's about voice. Who gets to decide how fast the fields are pumped? Who sets the wage scales in Khuzestan? Who answers for a spill, a shutdown, or a sudden price cut that squeezes the national treasury? Now, consider the macro picture. Oil revenues can be a blessing or a trap. If they're reliable and fairly shared, they fund infrastructure, schools, public health. If they're volatile and opaque, they push governments toward short-term fixes, patronage, and the politics of the payout. That's the seed of a rentier dynamic. The state leans on resource income instead of broad taxation, and when citizens aren't taxed, the loop of accountability weakens. No need to hammer the theory here, just watch the behavior it encourages. So by 1950, before any coup plots or headline crises, we already have the critical ingredients. A legacy concession that concentrates power outside Iran. A refinery complex that ties local livelihoods to decisions made in distant boardrooms. A revenue stream that can rise spectacularly and fall without warning. And a growing chorus inside Iran asking an obvious question: if this is our oil, why aren't we in charge of it? Keep that question in mind as we move forward, because everything that follows will orbit this original design choice. The contracts, the embargoes, the cabinet meetings and street demonstrations, even the fateful moves in 1953? They're all responses to the incentive structure built in 1901 and adjusted in 1933. Change the rules, change the outcomes. Leave the rules intact, and pressure will find another exit. Ready to see what happens when a nation tries to rewrite those rules? Let's pick up the thread. A new prime minister steps into the spotlight, Mohammad Mossadegh. Elder statesman, legal mind, and a gifted communicator who could turn constitutional law into kitchen table language. His case to the Majlis is surprisingly simple: a sovereign nation should control its own resources, especially when a decades-old concession has failed to deliver fair terms. It isn't just sentiment. It's an argument about incentives and accountability. If decisions about prices, production, and profits are made outside Iran, how can Iranian leaders ever be responsible to Iranian voters? The Majlis votes to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. On paper, that means two things at once. First, the refinery, the fields, and the operations move under Iranian control. Second, the government promises to compensate the former concession holder. So this isn't a declaration of take everything and run. It's a legal position: we own it, we'll pay, let's negotiate the numbers. But once you change ownership, you change leverage. And leverage rarely shifts quietly. Britain responds with the tools it knows best: law, finance, and logistics. In the courts, British lawyers framed this as a contract dispute, pressing claims about jurisdiction and compensation. In the City of London and allied banks, financial channels tighten. Insurance becomes hard to obtain for any ship daring to load Iranian crude. And at sea, a web of pressures grows: tankers are warned off, buyers are discouraged, and a nation that once exported oil sees cargo after cargo fail to materialize. No bombs, no dramatic battles. Just a slow strangulation through the plumbing of world commerce. What does that look like on the ground? Start with foreign exchange. Without oil exports, dollars and pounds stop flowing into Iran's central bank. That makes it harder to pay for imports, from spare parts to wheat. Then employment. The Abadan refinery, a small city unto itself, stalls. Skilled workers are idle. Local businesses that depend on refinery wages feel the chill. Think of it as a complex machine where one gear has been removed. The whole system doesn't explode. It just grinds, groans, and then begins to seize. Mossadegh tries to navigate the squeeze with policy triage. He seeks interim buyers willing to defy British pressure. He explores alternative shipping arrangements. He cuts some state expenses, leans on patriotic appeals, and attempts to reassign technical staff to keep critical functions alive. But every workaround now competes with a global embargo assembled by a former imperial power with deep links to shipping, insurance, and finance. Even countries that sympathize hesitate. The cost of buying Iranian oil suddenly includes diplomatic friction and commercial risk. Now zoom out. This standoff isn't simply about barrels. It's a clash between two systems of ordering the world. On one side, contractual continuity, the view that long-term concessions, even if imperfect, should be honored to preserve investor trust. On the other, political sovereignty, the view that a democratic mandate can rewrite rules when those rules undermine the nation's welfare. Both claims have logic. But when negotiation collapses, the arena of decision shifts from conference tables to balance sheets and port schedules. In that arena, the side that controls the global choke points tends to win the early rounds. Inside Iran, the social temperature rises. National pride runs high, but pride does not buy bread or spare parts. Urban supporters rally for Mossadegh's stand. Critics warn that the economy cannot absorb prolonged isolation. Newspapers argue about compensation formulas and the morality of embargo. In Khuzestan, where oil once pulsed through daily life, uncertainty spreads. People begin to ask uneasy questions. How long can we hold our breath? Who will blink first? And if we do compromise, what exactly did we gain? Here's the paradox of nationalization under siege. You can win the legal principle yet lose the practical capacity to exercise it. Control without cash flow is a fragile victory. Meanwhile, every week of shut-in production lowers government revenue, intensifies fiscal pressure, and nudges politics toward sharper edges. When treasuries run lean, the temptation grows to centralize more decisions, to manage scarcity from the top, and to make exceptions that become habits. No ideology needed to see the pattern, it's the political economy of emergency. And yet, notice something else. Iran's stand reverberates beyond its borders. Other producing countries watch closely. If Iran can reset terms, perhaps the entire industry must evolve. If Iran is punished, perhaps others should negotiate first and avoid a showdown. In that sense, the siege is not only about Iran. It is a signal to the world about how far a nation can go when it tries to rebalance a lopsided bargain. So by the end of this phase, two realities coexist. On the street, a proud, elected government insists on sovereignty and offers compensation. On the water and in the ledgers, a disciplined embargo starves the policy of oxygen. Which system bends first, the national will or the international supply chain? That is the question hanging over Tehran in 1953. We've seen pressure applied through courts and commerce. Now watch how that pressure gets translated into a plan. In Washington and London, officials begin to treat Iran not only as a legal dispute but as a solvable operations problem. The question on their desks is blunt: if embargo and diplomacy aren't shifting Tehran, can covert action reorder the incentives inside Iran's politics? Enter the joint design with two labels: T-Pax to the Americans, boot to the British. Think of it as a project plan for political engineering. You have a target environment with multiple actors, clerics, military officers, parliamentarians, newspaper editors, bazaar merchants, neighborhood toughs. Each has a price, a fear, a hope, or a grievance. The operative's job is to map those levers and pull enough of them, in the right sequence, to tip the balance without open war. First, they budget for narrative. Not speeches from podiums, the quieter kind. Paid placements in newspapers. Rumors seeded in tea houses. Leaflets that look like they came from rivals, not from embassies. Radio scripts drafted to question a leader's competence today and his motives tomorrow. The goal isn't a single big lie, it's cumulative doubt. You don't have to convince everyone. You just have to make enough people wonder whether the government can keep the lights on next week. Second, they recruit or reactivate intermediaries. Former officers with prestige in the barracks. Parliament figures with access to procedural choke points. Clerics who can frame political decisions as moral obligations. Bazaar guild leaders who can move crowds quickly in the narrow streets. Notice the pattern: the plan does not try to command society directly. It tries to bend the brokers who already command attention. Third, they identify a replacement who can be sold as lawful continuity rather than rupture. A general Zahidi, whose profile checks key boxes: military credibility, connections into conservative circles, and a relationship with the monarch that can be presented as constitutional. Why does that matter? Because legitimacy is a scarce commodity in moments of crisis. If you can claim that your move is not a revolution but a restoration, you lower the cost of switching sides for risk-averse elites. Fourth, they script the legal choreography. Drafts of royal decrees. Lists of officers to be reassigned or arrested. Timing windows when key ministries are lightly staffed. Routes to and from radio transmitters. Think of it like stage direction for a city. If this gate is opened and that microphone goes live while these officers receive sealed orders, you can reshape the story people tell themselves by nightfall. Fifth, they arrange physical capacity on the street. That can mean hiring muscle for demonstrations, but it also means paying for trucks, printing presses, safe houses, and the most prosaic tool of all, the cash. Small payments move small decisions. A police captain looks the other way for an hour. A foreman releases his crew for an unplanned rally. An editor runs a risky headline because his reporter's wages were covered last week. In political markets, liquidity is leverage. Sixth, they cultivate deniability. Operations are routed through cutouts, local figures who can move money and men without connecting visibly to foreign stations. Messages travel in layered channels, personal couriers, one-time pads, and, at times, the old-fashioned method of a trusted friend vouching face-to-face. Why so much effort to stay invisible? Because the plan only works if everyone inside Iran believes that what they're doing is Iranian politics, not a foreign pageant. Now, step back and observe the system's logic. Covert planners are not omnipotent, they are portfolio managers of uncertainty. They can't force a specific outcome, but they can buy options: more doubt in newspapers, more friction inside units loyal to the government, more confidence among fence-sitters that an alternative leadership exists and will be recognized. Each option is small on its own. The aim is to stack enough of them that when a triggering moment arrives, a decree, a confrontation, a misstep, the path of least resistance points away from the status quo. There's also a moral undercurrent worth noticing. This is politics with the lights dimmed. Citizens reading a headline won't see the ledger line that paid for it. A colonel receiving a visit doesn't see the memorandum that listed his name. A cleric giving a sermon doesn't show his listeners the back-channel assurances he received the night before. The design relies on one fact of human life: when information is asymmetric, power can move faster than consent. And yet, even the most careful plan meets reality. Street networks are messy. Alliances shift. A rumor backfires. An officer has second thoughts. Operatives write phase A and phase B on paper, but cities breathe. That's why the plan builds redundancy: multiple newspapers, multiple routes to key sites, multiple ways to claim legality. If one thread snaps, the fabric holds. So by late summer 1953, what do we have? Not an ending, but a loaded machine: narratives primed, intermediaries lined up, legal documents drafted, logistics rehearsed, and cash in circulation. The architects believe they've increased the probability that, under stress, the political system will tilt toward their preferred configuration. Whether it does, or how cleanly, isn't something any memo can guarantee. Here's where plans meet gravity. The first move comes at night. Royal decrees are prepared, orders are carried by couriers, and a detachment is meant to arrest the Prime Minister, cleanly, swiftly, before dawn. But the city breathes differently than paper predicts. Loyalists are alerted, arrests don't stick, and instead of a quiet handover you get confusion at the gates. The initial putsch stalls. It doesn't look like a transfer of authority, it looks like a botched attempt. And that matters because in a crisis, perception is oxygen. By morning, the monarch, already cautious, chooses flight over roulette. He leaves, and that image travels fast, a sovereign in exile, a government still seated in Tehran. For a moment, the story tilts toward the prime minister. If the head of state has fled, hasn't the government survived the blow? Newspapers, cafes, and barracks all hum with the same question, is this over? Except it isn't. A failed first strike doesn't end the game, it resets it. Think of the city as a chessboard where pieces are not static, they're persuadable. Over the next days, the focus shifts to key nodes that can flip momentum. Radio transmitters, newspaper offices, intersections where crowds can be assembled quickly, and military units whose loyalty is elastic under pressure. The currency now is coordination. Paid crowds begin to appear, but not as a cartoonish mob. They intermingle with the simply curious, the aggrieved, the opportunistic. A truck circulates with posters and a handful of men ready to shout the first slogans. Passers-by respond, a knot becomes a column. And columns matter in Tehran's narrow streets. They look like inevitability. Meanwhile, editors receive suggestions about headlines and framing. A waffling headline becomes a declarative one. Rumors about the government's competence turn into confident assertions of its failure. Inside the armed forces, critical hinges are tested. A colonel hesitates, a general makes a call, a unit is reassigned from guarding one building to rest in a less relevant spot. Each small motion looks bureaucratic. In aggregate, it changes who can move where when the city's temperature spikes. If you control which units are positioned near radio stations and road junctions at noon, you don't need to control every unit by dusk. Then comes August 19th, the day when the options purchased in advance come due. Demonstrations swell and split, giving cover for decisive moves. A radio facility flips hands. A newspaper presses a special edition that frames events as lawful correction rather than rupture. Military detachments that were previously ambiguous show up in the right place at the right hour. The Prime Minister's residence becomes a focal point. The line between crowd and force blurs, and with it the sense of who is in charge. By evening, the outcome is legible on the street. The Prime Minister is out. General Zahedi steps forward as the named alternative, presenting continuity, not chaos. The monarch, previously a silhouette in flight, now has a lane to return with the appearance of constitutional order restored. For citizens watching, the narrative that began as a failed putsch ends as a successful coup because the institutions that broadcast legitimacy, soldiers at intersections, headlines in print, a voice on the radio, now align. Pause on the mechanics. No single lever explains the swing. It's timing plus access plus narrative. A failed arrest didn't doom the effort, it created a window to reconfigure the city's mind. Paid crowds mattered, but only in concert with units that moved at the right moment and media nodes that told the public what those movements meant. In a complex political market, the winning bid is the one that clears all three: street presence, coercive capacity, and a story that lets fence-sitters sleep at night. So the 4 days compress into a simple arc. Attempt fails. Monarch flees. Networks recalibrate. City pivots. New leadership installs. And with that, the center of power reorients. Not through a public debate. Through the choreography of a capital under pressure. When the dust settles, policy moves from the streets to the spreadsheets. Iran's oil sector doesn't return to the old concession, it's reassembled under a new arrangement that looks modern and cooperative on the surface, an international consortium. The headline reads like a compromise. Iran regains formal ownership and a share of revenues. The consortium provides capital, technology, and access to global markets. But the power of any system is in its plumbing. Let's walk through the pipes. First, equity and control. The new structure divides participation among major foreign firms, large American companies, the British firm that once held the concession, plus Shell, and the French company that will later be known as Total. Each brings tankers, refineries abroad, marketing outlets, and crucially, a web of long-term supply contracts. That network is the true asset. It decides whose oil gets blended where, who gets first call on refinery slots, and how quickly cargoes are rerouted when markets shift. On paper, Iran owns the resource. In practice, the consortium orchestrates how barrels meet buyers. Second, the profit-sharing formula. The public message emphasizes a roughly 50-50 split as the new global norm. That sounds fair, symmetrical, even elegant. Yet a split is only as transparent as the ledger it rests on. If operational costs, transfer prices, and shipping terms are largely computed inside the consortium's own accounting systems, then the base used to calculate Iran's share is, to some degree, a house number. Again, not a conspiracy, just the structural advantage that comes with controlling the measurement tools. Third, risk allocation. Who bears what when the unexpected happens? If a pipeline requires an expensive overhaul, if global prices dip, if a refinery abroad needs to run a different blend, the consortium has multiple dials to spread and smooth those shocks across its worldwide portfolio. Iran, by contrast, experiences revenue volatility more directly. Imagine two rain barrels connected by a narrow hose. The global system absorbs the storm with many outlets. The single barrel rises and falls faster. Fourth, the marketing channel. Reopening Abadan is not simply an engineering victory, it's an invitation back into the club of refineries, distributors, and long-term offtake agreements. That club reduces the day-to-day friction of selling oil. But membership also shapes behavior. If the channel that carries your lifeblood is owned by partners, you will rarely be in a position to dictate price, destination, or timing. You negotiate within the rails you just rejoined. Fifth, domestic incentives. Fresh revenues begin to flow again. Budgets breathe. Development projects get green lights. Yet revenue without deep transparency can tempt short horizons. It becomes easier to spend than to reform. When money arrives through a tap controlled elsewhere, domestic politics can revolve around controlling the tap handle rather than building institutions that outlast the next price cycle. Think of it as the difference between owning a bakery and receiving a slice from a cake baked in someone else's kitchen. You can plan your day around either, until the baker changes the recipe. Sixth, geopolitical alignment. The consortium is not just a business. It's a coalition of firms embedded in states with security interests. When policy questions arise, shipping lanes, pricing coordination, currency convertibility, the same partners at your oil table sit at other tables in other capitals. The upside is predictable access to markets. The downside is that disputes can spill across domains. A decision made for commercial reasons on Monday can look like foreign policy by Friday. So what, in plain language, did the New Deal buy? It bought throughput. Tankers moved again. Wages were paid. The refinery roared back to life. It also bought time for the government to stabilize, time for international buyers to return without diplomatic drama, time for the narrative to shift from crisis to normalcy. But every purchase has a price. The price here was an architecture that placed the most sensitive levers, marketing, measurement, and operational coordination, inside a foreign-managed consortium. None of this requires cynicism to understand. It's the logic of complex supply chains. Those who own the bottlenecks, shipping, refining, and customer contracts shape outcomes even when they don't own the wellhead. Iran's formal sovereignty increased, its practical dependence on external plumbing also increased. That's not a paradox. It's a trade. Now consider the long view. A system that reliably delivers cash can fund real progress, roads, schools, electrification. But a system that funnels decision rights outward can also dull the incentive to diversify or to cultivate domestic accountability. When revenues arrive with limited visibility into the underlying costs, the public's ability to evaluate stewardship weakens. Over time, that gap between ownership on paper and control in practice becomes a political fact people feel, even if they can't see the spreadsheets. So the consortium solved a pressing problem: how to get oil and money moving again, by embedding Iran in a structure that balanced books and geopolitical interests in tandem. It stabilized the present by committing the future to a set of partners whose priorities might not always be the same as Iran's. That is the incentives reset. After a political earthquake, governments often reach for the same toolkit: tighten control, manage the narrative, and prevent surprises. In Iran's case, that meant consolidating power around the monarch and building a security architecture to keep the new order steady. On paper, this is a classic state-building move. In practice, it changes how people live, speak, and organize. Start with the center of gravity. The royal court becomes the coordination hub for major decisions. Ministries that once jostled for influence now calibrate their plans to the palace's preferences. Governors, police chiefs, and senior bureaucrats learn quickly that promotions follow loyalty and predictability more than debate or experimentation. If you were a mid-level official, what lesson would you take? Keep things quiet. Avoid surprises. Say yes first, ask questions later. Now, the security layer. A new intelligence and internal security service takes shape, known by an acronym that will become part of everyday vocabulary, SEVAC. Its mandate is broad. Find threats early. Monitor political groups. Detect foreign subversion. In theory, that sounds like a shield against chaos. In execution, it becomes a web. Informants in universities. Files on activists, clerics, editors, and union organizers. Interviews that start as just a few questions and end with a reminder to stay within approved lines. Notice how quickly this changes incentives. If a newspaper editor wonders whether a headline will be read by a censor before it is read by the public, the safest headline becomes the bland one. If a professor suspects that a student might be reporting seminar conversations, the safest lecture becomes the predictable one. If a small business owner needs a permit, the safest strategy becomes cultivating patrons rather than speaking up about rules that don't make sense. None of this requires mass arrests to be effective. It's the quiet economics of caution. There is also a public choreography to maintain the image of order. Elections may be held, but candidate lists narrow. Parliamentary debates may continue, but with fewer sharp edges. Demonstrations are smaller, more managed, or moved out of the frame before they grow. Each of these choices sends a message: participation is welcome as long as it does not attempt to redirect the system. People adapt. They don't necessarily abandon their views, they change where they voice them. What about the short-term benefits? They are real. Trains run on time more often. Strikes are rarer. Administrations can push through development plans without the friction of constant opposition. Foreign investors like predictability, and predictable environments tend to unlock loans, contracts, and technical partnerships. For a while, everyday life can feel more stable, especially if your main concern is getting paid on Friday, not arguing about policy on Wednesday. But stability bought this way accrues a hidden interest cost. When dissent has no safe outlet, it moves into private spaces where the state's feedback sensors are weak. When newspapers signal that everything is fine, problems are solved later, not sooner. When security services become the main diagnostic tool for society's tensions, every issue starts to look like a threat to be contained, rather than a problem to be argued through. Over time, the state's ability to learn from its citizens diminishes. There's a subtle moral shift too. Citizens begin to measure their lives not against laws alone, but against invisible lines: what can be said without a call, what gathering will go unremarked, which acquaintance is safe to trust. That uncertainty is its own kind of tax. It costs time, energy, and the small courage people expend to be honest with one another. You don't see it on a budget ledger. You feel it in quieter streets and cautious conversations. It's tempting to imagine that increasing control and increasing prosperity can rise together without friction. Sometimes they do, for a season. But a system that concentrates decision-making while shrinking open debate relies on the assumption that planners can perceive problems early and fix them cleanly. History suggests that perception narrows in such environments. People tell superiors what they want to hear. Metrics are massaged. Early warnings arrive late. So by the late 1950s, life in Iran carries two simultaneous truths. The surface of daily order is smoother, fewer public clashes, more visible projects, a government that looks coordinated from the outside. Beneath that surface, the channels through which society corrects its rulers, criticism, contestation, and consent, have narrowed. The gap between what is said publicly and what is felt privately begins to widen. That gap is not yet a crisis. It is a reservoir. Look at the line graph on this slide, running from 1949 to 1960. You can see the embargo dip and then the rebound after the oil settlement. Production climbs. Revenues climb. On the surface, that looks like recovery. But the more interesting story is underneath the line: how those revenues change the relationship between the state and its citizens. Here's the core idea in plain language. When a government funds itself mostly through taxing people's work and trade, it has to ask those people for money regularly. Asking requires explanation. Explanation invites argument. Argument creates a habit of accountability. That is one kind of loop. When a government funds itself largely through external rents, royalties and payments from selling a resource to the outside world, it can meet payroll without knocking on most citizens' doors. Fewer knocks, fewer explanations, fewer arguments. That is a different loop. Now, take the schematic on the right: two funnels. The first funnel is taxation. Money flows from households and firms into the treasury. In return, services and public goods flow back. Because the money comes from the governed, they demand line of sight into how it is used. The second funnel is the rent channel. Money flows into the treasury from oil buyers abroad and partner firms. Citizens still receive services, but they are not the primary payers. The pressure to explain is weaker. The pressure to distribute is stronger. Consider incentives. In a tax-driven system, the cheapest way to raise more revenue is to help people produce more and exchange more. That nudges policy toward better roads, clearer rules, and fewer arbitrary delays. In a rent-driven system, the easiest way to shore up support is to control who gets slices of the windfall. That nudges policy toward patronage, licenses, and gatekeeping. Neither tendency is automatic or permanent, but the path of least resistance points in different directions. Volatility matters too. Oil revenue is not a steady paycheck, it's a commodity cycle. Prices boom, and suddenly there is room in the budget for grand projects. Prices sag, and the same commitments become hard to keep. In the boom, leaders learn that buying quiet with payouts works. In the bust, they learn that cutting those payouts hurts. Over time, the lesson is simple and dangerous. When in doubt, centralize more choices so you can keep promising more cushions. That is the policy feedback loop you are seeing, even if the graph itself only shows barrels and dollars. Let's make it concrete. Imagine two neighborhoods. In the first, the city funds itself through property and sales taxes. The council meets often because shopkeepers and homeowners show up with receipts and questions. In the second, the city gets a check each quarter from a factory owned by outsiders. The council still meets, but the most important conversation is now inside the building: which projects and which allies get priority this quarter. The public still matters, but the decisive bargaining shifts inward. There's another subtle shift: information. In a tax system, the state's best sensors are citizens filing returns and businesses reporting sales. The Treasury learns where activity is rising or falling. In a rent system, the best sensors are export contracts, partner accounting statements, and global price curves. That means the state knows a great deal about loading schedules and refinery slots, but it may hear late about stresses in a university, a clinic, or a small-town labor market. When the sensors point outward, internal problems become visible later than they should. Does this doom a country to stagnation? No. Rent income can build roads, fund schools, and finance public health. It can be saved in stabilization funds, managed with transparent rules, and paired with broad-based taxes to keep the feedback loop alive. But such discipline is a choice, not a built-in feature. Path dependence is the reason. Early decisions about how to spend, whom to reward, and how to measure success create constituencies around those practices. The longer they persist, the more expensive they become to unwind. Finally, notice the political psychology that grows in this soil. If citizens feel that benefits arrive from a distant pipeline rather than from their own productive effort and voice, participation can drift from "I shape the rules I pay for" toward "I line up where the tap is." That doesn't show up on the revenue chart. It shows up in how often people speak freely at town halls, how willing editors are to print awkward truths, and how quickly officials admit a mistake. So when you see the rebound in output and money after 1954, read it in two layers. Yes, revenue returned and projects moved. But the channel that carried that money also rewired incentives, fewer knocks on doors for taxes, more decisions made by a narrower circle, and a habit of managing political support as a distribution problem rather than a negotiation with taxpayers. That is the mechanism by which rents shape institutions even when intentions are good. Let's step out of Tehran for a moment and look sideways. Around mid-century, other oil-producing countries faced similar tensions with foreign companies, old concessions, opaque accounting, and a growing demand for fairer terms. Yet in places like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, the path taken was different. Instead of regime change, you see negotiated profit-sharing settlements that reset the rules without toppling the table. Start with Venezuela in the 1940s. The government pushed for a simple, legible standard, an equal split of profits between the state and the companies. The famous 50-50. Why did that number matter? Not because it was magically fair, but because it was clear. It set a benchmark that investors could plan around and voters could understand. The companies kept operating, the state's share increased, the new rule became a focal point for future bargaining. Think of it as switching from haggling in a back room to posting a menu in the window. Fewer surprises, fewer excuses. Now glance at Saudi Arabia around 1950. The kingdom, working with a consortium led by American firms, secured a deal that effectively lined up with that same 50-50 principle. Again, the companies kept their integrated networks, tankers, refineries abroad, downstream markets, but the producing state's claim on the surplus rose in a structured, predictable way. The risk didn't vanish, neither did the asymmetric information. But the relationship moved onto a framework that could be adjusted without threatening to blow up the partnership each time prices shifted. What do these cases have in common? First, the power of a standard. Once a 50-50 benchmark becomes normal, it's easier for a producer to ask, why aren't we at least there? Standards don't end conflict, they narrow the battlefield. Second, an appreciation for sequencing. When governments and firms agree on a rule that both can live with, they buy time to build trust or at least to keep arguing inside an agreed corridor. And third, a recognition that control of the marketing chain still matters. Even with better revenue splits, companies with global logistics and downstream outlets retain leverage. But the host state now has a larger, more transparent stake and more political room to invest, tax, or save in ways that calm domestic pressure. Now, here's the contrast. In Iran, the move was nationalization first, negotiation second, under embargo. That front-loaded political sovereignty, which had its own moral and legal force, but it also triggered a counter-move that shifted the conflict from contracts to choke points. Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, by comparison, pursued rule evolution inside the structure of ongoing operations. The result wasn't utopia. It was a pathway to improve terms without putting the entire system under siege. None of this says one path was easy or painless. Each country had its own internal factions, external pressures, and moments of brinkmanship. But the pattern is instructive. Where a clear, credible rule emerged, like the equal split, governments could claim a visible win without collapsing the plumbing that moved all to market. Where rule changes arrived as a political shock, even a justified one, the response tended to be organized around financial isolation and logistical interruption. That is not a moral verdict, it's a systems observation. There's also a lesson about the politics of measurement. 50-50 is an attractive slogan, but it lives or dies on what counts as profit. The countries that did better over time pushed for incremental gains in transparency, audits with teeth, clearer definitions of allowable costs, and occasional reopeners when conditions changed. In other words, they treated the relationship as a rulebook to be revised, not a one-time triumph. Small wins compounded. So imagine an alternate branch of history. If a producing country can spotlight a widely accepted standard, secure it without a public breakdown of operations, and then keep nudging the measurement rules toward daylight, you get a different kind of feedback loop. Less energy spent on survival maneuvers, more energy spent on building institutions that outlast any single price cycle. In that branch, sovereignty isn't declared in one dramatic moment, it's accumulated, clause by clause, audit by audit. The takeaway from this wider view isn't that negotiation always beats confrontation. It's that durable gains often come from recognizable rules that both sides can explain to their constituencies. Rules change behavior. Behavior changes expectations. And once expectations shift, the political cost of backsliding rises for everyone involved. We've walked through contracts, embargoes, plans on paper, and days when the city itself decided. Now step back and look at the curve that really matters, the arc from short-term stability to long-term legitimacy. The 1953 outcome delivered immediate throughput. Oil moved. Budgets unfroze. Partners abroad nodded. But legitimacy is not throughput. It's consent renewed over time. And when consent is dented by invisible hands and dim rooms, the costs compound quietly, then loudly. What did the system actually teach its participants? Elites learned that external networks could reorder domestic politics faster than votes could. Mid-level officials learned that loyalty outperforms candor. Citizens learned that what they see on the radio today can be reversed by paperwork they will never read tomorrow. Markets learned that choke points are power. And the state learned to reach for security solutions where civic ones might have worked earlier. Each lesson has a half-life. Each one narrows the lanes through which trust can flow. Consider the moral geometry. If a government is toppled in the name of stability, but the new stability relies on tighter control and outsourced decision rights, whose stability is it? If revenues rise while the habit of public argument falls, is prosperity deepening or simply pooling? And if citizens come to believe that the most consequential bargains about their lives are struck elsewhere, how many of them decide that only rupture can reset the terms? These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are the seeds of future headlines. There is also the quieter counterfactual we kept meeting at the edges. Rules can evolve. Contracts can be rewritten without collapsing the machine that feeds them. Standards like equal splits can become scaffoldings for better audits, clearer costs, and more grown-up bargaining. None of that makes politics gentle. It makes it legible. And legibility is how societies argue without breaking. The choice between pride and pragmatism is often a false one. The better choice is to design rules that make dignity predictable. So what endures from this story? First, that systems remember. Incentive structures built in 1901 and tweaked in 1933 set constraints that even courageous leaders struggle to escape. Second, that coercion has a long echo. You can push a society into a new posture, you cannot make it trust you for free. Third, that decentralization is not a slogan but a set of practices, transparency about costs, competition in ideas, and consent that can say no without being punished. Where those practices thicken, stability becomes a byproduct rather than a precondition. Open questions to carry with you: when, if ever, does externally engineered order produce legitimacy rather than merely quiet? Which institutions are we building today that will either cushion or amplify the next shock? And in your own community, what are the choke points that look efficient now but might turn brittle later? If this made you think, here's my ask. Like the video, drop a comment with your perspective, and subscribe for more thoughtful history that refuses to choose between clarity and complexity. And if you want to go deeper, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase, linked in the description. Explore the channel for more episodes that balance storytelling with hard evidence. I'll see you in the next one.